Story 1. The night hung heavy over the desolate stretch of highway, where shadows danced in the moonlight, whispering secrets to the wind. It was a road that few dared to tread after sunset, for tales of its eerie reputation had spread far and wide. They spoke of strange disappearances, of vehicles swallowed whole by the darkness, never to be seen again. Among the legends whispered in hushed tones, there was one tale that stood out above the rest: the legend of the Vanishing Mile Marker. It was on a moonless night much like this one that a young couple, Sarah and David, found themselves driving down that ominous highway. They were on their way to visit Sarah's parents, unaware of the peril that awaited them. As they cruised along the deserted road, David couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in the pit of his stomach. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" he asked, glancing at the GPS screen. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "According to the GPS, we're on the right track. Just a few more miles to go." But as they continued their journey, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the darkness closing in around them like a suffocating blanket. And then, just as David was about to voice his concerns, they saw it, the mile marker, looming ominously in the distance. Relief flooded through David as they approached the marker, but it was short-lived. For as they drew nearer, they realized that something was terribly wrong. The mile marker seemed to shimmer and waver in the moonlight, its numbers shifting and twisting in the darkness. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. David's heart pounded in his chest as he slowed the car to a stop. Fear clawed at him, threatening to consume him whole. But despite the terror that gripped him, he knew they couldn't turn back now. They had to press on, no matter the cost. With trembling hands, David put the car into gear and pressed down on the accelerator. The engine roared to life, the headlights piercing the darkness ahead. But no matter how fast they drove, the mile marker remained just out of reach, taunting them with its elusive presence. "We have to get out of here," David said, his voice tinged with desperation. But even as he spoke, he knew it was too late. The mile marker had them in its grasp, ensnaring them in its web of darkness. And as they continued to drive, the road began to twist and turn, leading them further and further from the safety of civilization. Hours passed in a blur of terror and confusion, until finally, Sarah let out a cry of despair. "We're lost," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. David knew she was right. They were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. But even as hope faded, he refused to give up. They had come too far to turn back now, and he would do whatever it took to keep Sarah safe. As dawn broke on the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty highway, David made a decision. He would confront the mile marker head-on, no matter the consequences. With grim determination, he steered the car towards the shimmering beacon of light, his heart pounding in his chest. But as they drew nearer, David's resolve faltered. For in the cold light of day, the mile marker appeared as nothing more than a simple sign, its numbers clear and unambiguous. And as David gazed upon it, he realized the truth: the mile marker was not the source of their torment. It was merely a symptom of a much deeper evil that lurked within the darkness. With a heavy heart, David turned the car around and drove back the way they had come. And though they never spoke of that fateful night again, the memory of the vanishing mile marker haunted them for the rest of their days, a reminder of the horrors that lurked just beyond the edge of the unknown. Story 2. It was a dark, moonless night as Sarah drove down Interstate 66, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of asphalt, flanked by dense woods on either side. She glanced nervously at the clock on the dashboard. It was past midnight, and she still had a long way to go before reaching her destination. Sarah had been driving for hours, the monotony of the highway only broken by occasional glimpses of other cars speeding past. But now, as the miles dragged on, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her like a shroud. She turned up the volume on the radio, hoping that the music would drown out her thoughts. But the crackling static only seemed to amplify her growing sense of dread. Glancing out of the window, she saw the shadows of the trees looming over the road like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught her eye, a figure standing at the side of the road, just beyond the reach of the headlights. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she slowed down, her foot hovering over the brake pedal. Was it a hitchhiker? A stranded motorist in need of help? As she drew closer, she could make out the silhouette of a man, his features obscured by the darkness. He seemed to be waving frantically, as if trying to flag her down. Sarah hesitated, her instincts warring with her sense of compassion. She had heard enough horror stories about lone travelers being lured into traps by strangers on desolate highways. But something about the man's demeanor tugged at her conscience, and before she could stop herself, she had pulled over to the side of the road. Rolling down her window, she peered out into the night, her heart pounding in her chest. "Are you okay?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The man stepped forward into the glow of the headlights, and Sarah gasped in horror. His face was a mask of blood and bruises, his clothes torn and tattered. It was clear that he had been in some kind of accident, but there was something about his demeanor that sent shivers down her spine. "I need help," he croaked, his voice hoarse and strained. "Please, you have to help me." Sarah's mind raced as she weighed her options. She knew she should drive away, call for help, anything to avoid putting herself in danger. But the pleading look in the man's eyes tugged at her heartstrings, and before she could stop herself, she had opened the door and stepped out onto the deserted highway. "Let me take a look at you," she said, her voice trembling as she approached the man. But as she drew closer, a wave of dread washed over her like a tidal wave. There was something wrong about him, something unnatural. His eyes gleamed with a feral intensity, and his lips curled into a sinister smile. Before Sarah could react, the man lunged forward, his hands closing around her throat with a vice-like grip. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips as she fought for breath. Panic surged through her veins as she realized the truth. The man was no victim, but a predator, lurking in the darkness, waiting for unsuspecting prey to stumble into his trap. With a desperate surge of strength, Sarah fought back, clawing at the man's face with all her might. But he was too strong, his grip unyielding as he dragged her towards the edge of the woods. The trees loomed overhead like silent witnesses to her struggle, their branches swaying in the chill night air. As Sarah's vision began to blur, she saw a flicker of movement in the darkness, a figure emerging from the shadows, tall and imposing. For a moment, she dared to hope that help had arrived, that salvation was at hand. But as the figure drew closer, she realized the truth. It was another of the man's accomplices, drawn by the scent of fresh blood. With a sinking heart, Sarah knew that her fate was sealed, that she would join the countless others who had fallen victim to the horrors of Interstate 66. And as the darkness closed in around her, she whispered a silent prayer for deliverance, knowing that no one would hear her screams in the night. But on that desolate stretch of highway, where the shadows danced like demons and the silence echoed with the cries of the damned, there was no mercy to be found, only the endless, unyielding embrace of the night. Story 3. The old highway stretched out before them like a ribbon of faded asphalt, disappearing into the dense forest on either side. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white as she navigated the winding road. Beside her, Mark fidgeted nervously in the passenger seat, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Mark asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Yeah, the GPS said this is the quickest route to the cabin. We just have to keep going straight." But even as she spoke, Doubts gnawed at the edges of Sarah's mind. The highway seemed oddly deserted, devoid of any signs of life. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As they continued down the desolate stretch of road, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She stole glances at the forest lining the highway, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking among the trees. Suddenly, a figure darted across the road in front of them, causing Sarah to slam on the brakes. The tires screeched as the car skidded to a halt, coming to rest just inches from the edge of a steep ravine. Heart pounding, Sarah and Mark stared wide-eyed at the road ahead. But there was nothing there. No sign of the mysterious figure that had crossed their path. What was that? Mark whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of Sarah's heart. I don't know, Sarah replied shakily, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. But we need to get out of here. With trembling fingers, Sarah shifted the car into reverse and began to back up slowly. But as she did, a dense fog rolled in, swallowing the road behind them in a thick blanket of white. Panic rising in her chest, Sarah slammed her foot down on the gas pedal, willing the car to move faster. But no matter how hard she tried, the fog seemed to cling to them, enveloping the car in its icy embrace. We're trapped, Mark said, his voice filled with dread. Sarah swallowed hard, her mind racing as she tried to come up with a plan. But before she could speak, a voice echoed through the fog, sending shivers down her spine. Welcome to the highway of haunted memories, the voice whispered, sending a chill down Sarah's spine. With a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, Sarah realized that they were not alone on the road. Whatever had crossed their path earlier was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. We have to get out of here, Sarah said, her voice trembling with fear. But as she spoke, the car lurched to a sudden stop, the engine sputtering and dying as if choked by unseen hands. Frantically, Sarah and Mark tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. The car was dead, stranded in the middle of the haunted highway with no way out. As they sat in the darkness, enveloped by the fog, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She could sense eyes on them, unseen and malevolent, lurking just beyond the veil of mist. We have to leave the car, Mark said, his voice tinged with desperation. Nodding in agreement, Sarah reached for the door handle, her hand shaking as she pulled it open. Stepping out into the fog, she felt a cold chill run down her spine, raising goosebumps on her arms. Stay close, she whispered to Mark, her voice barely audible over the sound of their pounding hearts. Together, they stumbled through the fog, their eyes straining to see through the thick mist. But no matter how hard they tried, they could see nothing but swirling white all around them. Suddenly, a figure loomed out of the mist ahead of them, causing Sarah to scream in terror. But as the figure drew closer, she realized with a sinking feeling in her stomach that it was not human. It was a shadowy figure, its form shifting and twisting in the fog like smoke. And as it drew closer, Sarah could see a pair of glowing red eyes staring at them from the darkness. Paralyzed with fear, Sarah and Mark stood rooted to the spot as the figure approached, its presence filling them with a sense of dread unlike anything they had ever felt before. But just as the figure was about to reach them, a voice echoed through the fog, cutting through the silence like a knife. Sarah, Mark, is that you? It was a familiar voice, filled with concern and confusion. And as Sarah and Mark turned towards the sound, they saw a figure emerging from the fog, a flashlight in hand. Mom, Sarah whispered, disbelief coloring her voice. Running towards her mother, Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her face. They were saved, rescued from the darkness of the haunted highway by a familiar face. But as they embraced, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled upon something sinister, something ancient and malevolent that lurked in the shadows of the forest. And as they made their way back to the safety of the cabin, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what other secrets lay hidden in the depths of the haunted highway, waiting to be discovered by unsuspecting travelers. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.